It's my privilege to introduce Erik S. McDuffie, Associate Professor in the Department of African American Studies at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Professor McDuffie is currently at work on a book-length manuscript tentatively titled Garveyism in the Diasporic Midwest, the American Heartland and Global Black Freedom, 1920 through 1980. Drawing from original research conducted in Canada, Ghana, Grenada, Jamaica, Liberia, South Africa, Trinidad and Tobago, and the United States, this book is the first to establish the importance of the Midwest to 20th century Black transnational politics and to demonstrate vibrant political exchanges between the heartland and the African world through Garveyism. Professor McDuffie's forthcoming book has already received significant attention. In 2016, he won a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship to aid with the completion of the project. Earlier this year, the project also won a fellowship from the American Council of Learned Societies. He's the first person at the University of Illinois to win fellowships from both organizations in the same academic year. Professor McDuffie is also the author of Sojourning for Freedom, Black Women, American Communism, and the Making of Black Left Feminism, published by Duke University Press in 2011. The book received the 2012 Wesley Logan Prize from the American Historical Association and the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, as well as the 2011 Letitia Woods Brown Book Prize from the Association of Black Women Historians. Professor McDuffie's presentation today is titled From Fort Detroit to Ferguson, Why Studying Black Midwestern History Matters. Please help me give a warm welcome to Erik.
Good afternoon. It really is my pleasure being here today. It's wonderful being here in Grand Rapids. Actually, this is the first time I've been in downtown Grand Rapids. Been here before, but first time down here. It's a beautiful city. It's wonderful being back in my birth state of Michigan. I was born in Detroit and then came up in the suburbs of Cleveland, Ohio. Before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge and thank people for bringing me here and for coming. First of all, sir, to Scott St. Louis, I appreciate the invitation and helping to put my travel plans together. I'd like to thank Ms. Morgan Eaton. I don't know if she's here. Is she here? Miss Eaton, is she here? I guess not, but she was very, very helpful with my hotel accommodations. I'd like to give a special shout out. I'm really honored and flattered that my family came today to hear me speak. I'd like to acknowledge them and ask them to stand. First and foremost, I'd like to thank my parents, Marion and James McDuffie, my parents. Oh, thank you. I'd like to thank my children, Amir and Amaya McDuffie. They are 7th generation Midwesterners. Come on, guys, you stand up now. Indeed. I'd like to thank my cousin Ron Howell and my aunt Elizabeth Howell for driving out from Detroit. Thank you guys for coming. Thank you. And I would also like to acknowledge Ms. Deborah Jones, who is a subject of my book, but she also has become a good friend. Her grandmother is, the image of her grandmother is the top right on the screen. That is a woman by the name of Louise Little. You'll hear more about her during today's presentation. She was born in Grenada, and she is best known as the mother of Malcolm X. So, Ms. Jones is the niece of Malcolm X, and it has been an honor to meet her and to get to know her family. So again, Ms. Jones, please stand again, please. Thank you. All right. Why don't we get down to business? Time is of the essence. Now, I should note, a couple years ago when I was at the University of the West Indies at St. Augustine in Trinidad and Tobago, I spoke for close to 2 hours. And I'm proud to say that not a single person, including a graduate student, left early. But I understand that I only have about 40, 45 or so minutes, so I will keep this succinct. From Fort Detroit to Ferguson, why studying black Midwestern history matters in the era of Trump. And my plan for today, folks, is to raise some provocative questions, ask us to think very critically about the Midwest then and now in terms of its importance in building and creating this country, as well as its global impact, not only on the black world but beyond. And I jokingly say that in some ways I feel like the attention that my book project on Garveyism in the Midwest, I've joked around and said, or half jest, that the Cavs, LeBron James, the Cubs World Series victory, and the presidential victory of Donald Trump helped to shed light on the importance of the Midwest, help to show why talking about the Midwest is so important. Just a real quick anecdote, a couple years ago, I shared my book project with a colleague of mine based in New York City. He said, you know, Eric, this is a great project, it's fascinating, but I would never assign a book with Midwest in the title. Now, I should say that the person's not a good friend of mine. And now I'm not quite sure if I would even call him a friend per se, but again, it's amazing how when we're not in this region, especially on the coast, with how this region, of course, is considered flyover country, the backwoods, what have you. But again, especially the presidential election 2016, I think really indicates, highlighted the importance of the Midwest to U.S. life. And certainly what happened in 2016, I think, speaks to some very important themes that I will discuss today. Folks, there's no question that the Midwest, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, played a critical role in the election of Donald J. Trump as the 45th president. And there's no question as well that racism, misogyny, xenophobia, and Islamophobia, linked with economic anxieties fueled by globalization, played a crucial role in securing widespread white support for Trump that enabled him to win the election. And as we said already, the Midwest was absolutely critical in making that happen. And I say all that to say that one of the things I want to do today is in some ways put the presidential election, our current moment, into a kind of historical context. So, why studying the black Midwest matters. In the introduction by Richard Wright to St. Clair Drake's and Horace Caton's Black Metropolis, a study of Negro life in a northern city, published in 1945, the famous African-American novelist asserted that Chicago had produced the most, quote, incisive and radical African-American thought, end quote, in the world. The book's final chapter, Of Things to Come, looked to the future. Drake and Caton framed African-Americans in Bronzeville, the massive and dynamic black community on Chicago's South Side, as the barometer for measuring global freedom and human progress. They wrote, quote, so it is really only one world. The problems that arise on Bronzeville's 47th Street encircle the globe. But the people of Black Metropolis and of Midwest Metropolis do not feel that this relieves them from maintaining their own constant struggle for complete democracy as the only way to attain the world we say we want to build. The people of Bronzeville and of Midwest Metropolis and of all their counterparts are intertwined and interdependent. What happens to one affects all. A blow struck for freedom in Bronzeville finds its echo in Chongqing and Moscow, in Paris and Senegal. A victory for fascism in Midwest metropolis will sound the death knell of doom for the common man everywhere. Although they framed human freedom and progress in masculinist terms, it is undeniable that Drake and Caton's broad assertions remain as relevant today as they were more than 70 years ago. African Americans in Chicago, and indeed across the country, are still second-class citizens. White supremacy, socioeconomic disparities, state violence, and injustice remain salient factors in U.S. life and across the globe. The election of Donald Trump to the U.S. presidency and the rise of right-wing populist movements around the world attest to this fact. Despite this rightward turn, African Americans continue to fight back. Recent black struggles in cities like Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, Flint, and Ferguson against police brutality, environmental disaster, the dismantlement of public education, and state takeovers of municipalities have generated global attention and have inspired people around the world. Taking its cue from black metropolis, this paper will trace the dynamic history of African-descended people in this region that has come to be known as the Midwest from the 16th century to the present. I define the Midwest as a distinct historical, geographic, and discursive region within the U.S. that has played a key role in the making of this country's history and that of the world. The region is comprised of the 12 states defined by the U.S. Census Bureau. Although the Midwest history and culture have varied across space and time, several important characteristics bind together the heartland. From the 17th century through the 19th century, the region constituted an important settler frontier and transnational borderland. Beginning in the 19th century, the Midwest became this country's breadbasket. In the early and mid-20th century, the heartland emerged as the site of the world's most advanced industrial manufacturing. Millions of people from Eastern and Southern Europe, the U.S. South, and beyond came to this region in search of jobs and a better life. More recently, the Midwest has been ravaged by deindustrialization and globalization. However, the influx of new immigrants, especially from Latin America, the African world, and Asia, continue to transform this region. My paper will focus on the significance of the heartland, of the Midwest, to the African American experience, U.S. history, the African diaspora, and world. Paying careful attention to the gendered contours and global dimensions of black Midwestern history, I argue that studying the black Midwest matters for 4 interrelated reasons. First, the black Midwest provides key and unique insight into tracing the major historical developments of the modern world from the 16th century to the present. Issues such as settler colonialism, white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, slavery, abolition, migration, urbanization, industrialization, globalization, deindustrialization, and mass incarceration. Point 2, the Midwest represents the second most important region in African American history. The heartland has produced or become home to some of the most important black American writers, artists, and spokespersons who gained international fame. These activists include Ida B. Wells, Malcolm X, Louise Thompson Patterson, William L. Patterson, Fannie Barrier Williams, Jesse Jackson, C.L.R. James, James Boggs, and Earl and Louise Little. Artists and intellectuals like Margaret Burroughs, Langston Hughes, Toni Morrison, Randall Dudley, Gwendolyn Brooks, Katherine Dunham, St. Clair Drake, and Richard Wright. Musicians and groups like Aretha Franklin, Chuck Berry, Diana Ross, Charlie Parker, Howlin' Wolf, Bo Diddley, Yusef Lateef, The Temptations, Muddy Waters, Bootsy Collins, Earth, Wind and Fire, AACM, Comet, and Chance the Rapper. My students dig Chance the Rapper, and so do I. And folks, I hope you're following this, again, in terms of the names and peoples, again, the importance of this region and why this happened. There's a reason. As well as thinking about politicians like Oscar DePriest, Barack Obama, Carol Moseley Braun, Coleman Young, and Harold Washington. African-American Midwesterners have birthed or played a key role in powerful protests and cultural movements that have profoundly impacted the local and global. These include abolitionism, the Underground Railroad, immigration, women's clubs, the Garvey movement, trade unionism, civil rights, the Communist Party, the Moorish Science Temple of America, the Nation of Islam, Black Judaism, the Revolutionary Action Movement, RAM, the Black Panther Party, and most recently, Black Lives Matter. The unique encounters between political and economic opportunity, together with encountering virulent new forms of racial oppression and terror, help explain why and how the Midwest produced some of the most dynamic and globally connected black communities on the planet. Are folks following me here? Yes, all right. Point 3. The Black Midwest constitutes a counter-narrative to the prevailing framing of the heartland as a white, heteronormative, democratic, and enlightened region where everyday citizens, white citizens, enjoyed upward mobility and political freedom. This position was most famously forwarded by William Jackson Turner. The African-American Midwestern experience powerfully reveals the Midwest as a unique site of opportunity and oppression. 4th, and finally, the Midwest has and continues to constitute a key site for reimagining and fighting for transformative change on the local and global levels. Indeed, Black Midwestern history matters, not only because it sheds important light, insight into the making and significance of the heartland to the United States and modern world. More broadly, the African-American experience in the Midwest matters because it provides lessons for rethinking the past and for imagining a future world different from the one we have inherited. Just a few quick notes. I'd like to say a few comments about method and sources, and then we'll move into the body of the presentation. I think it's critical for scholars of the Midwest, historians of the Midwest, to employ transnational, global, and diasporic framework. And I know those terms are not synonymous, but I think it's critical for us to, again, kind of challenge this kind of nation-state or even locally based narrative or framing of this region. In doing so, that helps to kind of counter this idea of the Midwest as provincial and local. 2, it's critical that we use an intersectional framework. Again, drawing from Black feminism, drawing from Black and queer of color studies. Again, understanding how race, class, gender, sexualities, power, how these systems operate simultaneously and how they have shaped the past, present, and indeed the future. And point 3, the importance of employing an interdisciplinary framework. Again, so not just drawing from history, but drawing from anthropology, drawing from English, drawing from women's studies, drawing from cultural studies, from a broad range of fields in order to excavate the past, rethink it, and again, to think about the future. And lastly, I think we need to think creative about sources, about archives, primary and secondary sources, and I'll talk more about that during the Q&A. So that said, from now, I'm just going to talk for a few minutes and keep those key themes in mind and take it from here. Folks, it's important to keep in mind that peoples of African descent have lived in this region that we refer to now as the Midwest since the 16th century. Black folks did not simply arrive in the Midwest during the first and second great migrations during the early and mid-20th century. Again, the African presence has been here for centuries. Top left, that's an image of, well, actually backtrack. So going back as early as 1539, a Spanish friar named Fray Marcos apparently traveled through the Mississippi and Missouri valleys, and with him was an African servant. 2 years later, when Francisco Coronado traveled through the Missouri and Mississippi valleys, he was accompanied as well by an African servant. In fact, this person could have been the same person. Fast forwarding to the early 18th century, of course, top left, that's an image of Fort Detroit. Fort Detroit, founded, of course, in 1701 by Cadillac, a French fur trading post. And as early as 1736, in fact, I think it's quite likely that Africans were there before, we have records of Africans, French-speaking Catholic Africans in Fort Detroit. On the right is an image, of course, of Jean-Baptiste Pont de Salve, who is referred to as the founder, or rather the first non-native settler of Chicago. And again, thinking about all this through a kind of transnational lens and framework, of course, de Salve is believed to have been from Haiti, and that he was indeed committed against slavery, But also, I think what is particularly interesting as well about de Salve, bottom left, is a picture and image of what Chicago may have looked like back in the 1780s or so when de Salve first arrived. What's also interesting about him is that he was on cool terms among native people. He married an indigenous woman. He spoke indigenous languages. So again, this idea, again, thinking that, yes, the Midwest, or this region that we now call the Midwest, we cannot forget that we are standing on occupied land, land that was inhabited by indigenous peoples, and that de Salve apparently got along well with indigenous peoples. So again, a kind of alternative way about thinking about the frontier, thinking about so-called Western expansion. Moving into the 19th century, that while, of course, the bulk of the African population in this country was located in the South, certainly, of course, by the 19th century, a small but growing and vibrant black community emerged. And in contrary, or again, to kind of challenge this common perception of the South as being the center of racial oppression and the North being this citadel of freedom, certainly, of course, African peoples encountered their own virulent forms of racism. In fact, in some ways that helped that even prefigure the kind of racism that we would see following the Civil War and Reconstruction. So, for example, Illinois, Indiana, the Michigan Territory, all these states, yes, they abolished slavery in their state constitutions, but they all passed, prior to the 19th century, they all passed various laws to prohibit the entry of blacks into the territories, right? Black codes. Black codes were passed in 1819, 1829, and 1853 in the state of Illinois. That picture here is a photograph of the International Underground Railroad Memorial located on the banks of the Detroit River. And again, thinking about Detroit as a kind of borderland, as a kind of transnational space. The top picture is looking east towards Windsor, towards Canada, and the picture on the bottom is looking west towards the statue. That's what you would see. Again, keep in mind that Detroit was the busiest port, exit point of fugitive Africans escaping to Canada. And Africans, they swam, boated, did anything they could to get across this river, especially after, of course, the passage of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. So again, the way in which a small but dynamic black community emerged in places like Detroit, Chicago, elsewhere. Of course, the formation of black institutions. So, for example, the Second Baptist Church, formed in 1836, the oldest African-American church in the Midwest, again, formed in 1836, a church committed to anti-slavery. I'm proud to say that my great-grandfather was a pastor of this church. Oh, yes, indeed. So, again, a center of black activism, black community building. Let's fast forward and move into the late 19th and moving into the Great Migration. Top left, actually, I'm proud to say, that top left photograph, that's a photograph of my family. The woman on the right, that is my great-grandmother, Lottie Cook, after she became Mary Chandler. And there was a small, but again, dynamic African-American community in the Midwest, the Cook family, who were descendants of free blacks from Virginia, who made themselves quite wealthy. In fact, apparently my great-great-grandfather, the man second from the left, was the richest African-American in Detroit. But the point is, again, that a small but thriving African-American community existed. That's not to say that it was not without class tensions and divisions. It certainly was. But again, black folks made it, or rather tried to make it. At the same time, of course, the Great Migration, which first and second, which would bring more than 6 million African Americans from the South to the North between 1915 and 1970. Of course, this famous photograph on the right there of 5 young African American men on the South Side of Chicago. One of my favorite photographs. It speaks to, at one level, their pride, as well as perhaps ambivalence about what the future holds. Bottom right, bottom is a picture of Pilgrim Baptist Church, one of the largest African-American churches in the country then and now. And of course, that church was critical for the emergence of modern gospel music. Reverend Junius Austin, who in fact was a Garveyite preacher, who embraced the politics of Marcus Garvey, self-help, self-reliance, race pride. He understood the importance of both the traditional Southern cultures and the ways in which Southern cultures were changing and transforming in response to conditions in the urban North. And he welcomed gospel music, which of course was a combination of sacred music and the new rhythms and vibes of the urban North. And we'll talk more about music in a moment. But without question, the primary reason why black folk came up from the South was their search for a better life, for new jobs, and hope and freedom. This very famous mural, painted by the Mexican muralist Diego Rivera, painted in 1937, part of the Detroit murals, of course, at the Detroit Institute of Art. This famous mural in some ways captures Fordism, this new economic order of mass production, the assembly line, River Rouge, that would bring millions of people to the Midwest. In fact, right quick, again, think about the transnational dimensions of this. Rivera, of course, from Mexico, was a communist. His partner, his wife, Frida Kahlo, also a communist, was also, bisexual, transgressive, and both of them transgressive in so many ways. And again, how this coming together, how Detroit became a kind of a symbol, right, of the modern industrial capitalist order. And again, this region, Detroit, Chicago, Grand Rapids, the furniture city, right? These were centers. These were some of the most dynamic, this region was the most dynamic, the center of the most dynamic capitalist manufacturing on the planet. The region, of course, is also the site, as we said already, of very, very important black protest movements, black spokespersons, activists, everyday people who were at the front lines of struggle. Top left, of course, would be Louise Little and a photograph of her husband, Earl Little. Again, Louise Little, born in Grenada, she was the product of rape. Her father was a Scottish man who sexually assaulted her mother at the age of 11, producing her. Even though she was fair, straight hair, she was black to the bone. She identified herself with black people, and she took from her community, from her family in Grenada, pride, self-help, self-reliance, independence. She would move actually first to Montreal, Canada, and then that's where she actually met her husband and came into the Garvey movement. Again, Marcus Garvey, the Jamaican nationalist with Amy Ashwood Garvey, co-founded the largest black protest movement in world history in the early 20s that claimed more than 6 million members globally in the United States, the Caribbean, Central America, Europe, West Africa, Southern Africa, Eastern Africa, and indeed even Australia. Garveyism, of course, was foundational to the U.S. Black Freedom Movement, civil rights and black power, and foundational, of course, to independence movements across the black world. Both of them, again, thinking about this region both as a site of opportunity and a site of violence. The Littles went to Omaha, Nebraska, because it was a site of a horrific racial riot in 1919 in which whites accused a black man of raping a white woman. The white mob not only lynched the African American, but they also went after, and this is a trip, they actually went after the white mayor. The white mob tried to actually lynch the white mayor of Omaha. It wasn't successful, but Garvey was intrigued with what happened in Omaha because black folks fought back with guns, and he sent the Littles out to Omaha to build a chapter of the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Of course, in the middle, their son, Malcolm X, who would emerge as the most prominent U.S. black nationalist of the post-World War II era. Top right, photograph of James R. Stewart, who was the successor of the Garvey movement. When Garvey died in 1940, James Stewart, who was from Mississippi, but again, part of that great migration, moved to Cleveland. In fact, Stewart moved the headquarters of the UNIA to Cleveland, Ohio. And ultimately, in 1949, he quit this country and actually went to Liberia, where he lived out his last 15 years, and I've had the privilege of actually seeing his grave in Liberia. Actually, I've seen his childhood home in Mississippi, where he lived in Cleveland, and his final resting place in Liberia. And again, the ways in which Midwesterners, all the Littles, Brother Malcolm, James R. Stewart, how they understood African-American freedom in a global context. Bottom left, photograph of the Walk to Freedom, in Detroit, Michigan. In fact, if I'm correct, Mom and Aunt Liz, you both participated in this march, right, which was the largest civil rights protest of its time prior to the 1963 March on Washington. Of course, this march was led by Dr. King in Detroit. And again, that bottom placard, Evers died for you. Medgar Evers, again, the impact of 63, of Birmingham, the assassination of Medgar Evers, and again, what was going on globally. And then bottom right, a photograph of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. Again, Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago, sites of heavy industry and of black labor militancy. If there are any graduate students in here and y'all are trying to find a topic, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, man, does someone need to write a good book or more books on this group? Absolutely. Again, all these groups, again, understood the struggle in global terms, right? And represented the fact that the state went after all of these people in various ways. Louise Little, right, was put in a mental hospital because the state identified her, as in the state of Michigan. They saw her as being dangerous because she was independent, she owned her own land, she she didn't take stuff from white folks, and she spent more than 25 years in a mental hospital. But it was her family who got her out, and she lived 20 plus more years reconnecting with her family. The Black Midwest in terms of music. Where would we be culturally, intellectually, without the brilliant artists, books, poetry, visual art produced by black people from this region? Of course, Mom, Aunt Liz, Dad, right? Top left, The Temptations, right? Oh, yes, oh, yes. I can see you bobbing your head already, right? Sister Rosetta Tharpe, who was really critical in helping to kind of popularize gospel music outside of Chicago. Again, we so often think now we take gospel music for granted. Don't forget, there were a whole lot of good Christian folks who saw gospel as like the devil's music because it incorporated rhythm and blues and music from the juke joints into church. But she helped to popularize and transform the music. Bo Diddley. I mean, enough said, right? That Bo Diddley beat. The British invasion. And also that Bo Diddley beat, that bump, 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 bump. That's a mambo beat, right? That's from Congo. Oh, yes. Now, of course, he was born down south, but he made his way to Chicago. And again, these kind of diasporic influences. Bottom right, or rather center, Gwendolyn Brooks, the most important figure of the Black Chicago Renaissance, which in some ways was grittier and more radical even than its better-known counterpart, the Harlem Renaissance, way in which it produced, again, some cutting-edge literature, scholarship, artwork on black folks in the U.S. and indeed beyond. One of my favorite books, actually I think this is my favorite, novels by Toni Morrison from Lorain, Ohio. Oh, yes, from Ohio, Song of Solomon. And then again left, and again, in some ways, shout out to my kids here. That's, of course, Chance the Rapper. Yes, sweetie, you got it. There's Chance, and I dig Chance. He can rap. All right, I know time is of the essence. Certainly, of course, in the last 30, 40 years, the Midwest, especially cities like Detroit, Cleveland, Southside Chicago, have become symbols of the urban crisis. That everything that is possibly wrong, supposedly, with this country can be seen, can be identified in the city, in these cities. Of course, here's this photograph or various photographs of it of the Packard plant that is still standing, although it's falling apart, on East Grand Boulevard in Detroit. Again, Detroit is the only U.S. city that was at one point that counted more than 1 million people, that now counts less than 1 million people, a city that has been devastated, transformed by de-industrialization. Again, let's not forget again, so going back to the 20s and 30s, right? Chicago, of course, was the second biggest city in the country. Detroit, and then by the 30s, 40s, Detroit would, of course, be the fourth biggest city. Cleveland was in the top 10. Cleveland in 1950 counted more than 900,000 people in the city. Today, approximately 360,000 people in Cleveland, the city where I grew up. Cities that have been, again, just transformed by deindustrialization. Lest we forget that in the post-World War II years, Detroit suffered from between 1947 and 1963, suffered 4 serious economic recessions. The city lost in those years more than 134,000 manufacturing jobs alone. So again, when we talk about deindustrialization, all this, of course, started, right after the end of the Second World War. And what is so ironic, especially about, and the word ironic perhaps isn't even the right one, that, again, thinking about black people, it was the moment when black folks started to get those good-paying jobs in the mills and the auto plants. That's really when those industries tanked out. With automation, corporations intentionally moving production to the suburbs, to the U.S. South or beyond, again, trying to, in no small part, to get themselves away from labor militancy. River Rouge, going back to, of course, that mural by thank you, yes, Diego Rivera, right? How it captured this new moment, but again, black folks being forced out. This is something else. Again, a part of the conversation that so often gets forgotten. At the same time, again, getting back to one of our key points about the Midwest as a site for struggle, a site for reimagining the future. And there's no question that African Americans have been at the front lines of struggles for freedom that have generated worldwide attention. Certainly, of course, Black Lives Matter did not start in 2014 following the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, an inner-ring suburb of St. Louis, a city that, again, that at one point was one of the top 10 largest cities in the country, now counts about 320,000 people. A city that has gone through massive racial and class transformation. A city that, of course, was the site of major police and state violence against black people. Yes, Freddie Gray in Baltimore, Trayvon Martin, but really and arguably it was Ferguson, where the stakes and where the publicity and the anger as well as excitement and resistance really galvanized. We saw those images, right, beamed across the world of black people standing up to heavily armed police and guardsmen. Top right is actually a photograph of a Black Lives Matter protest in support of Michael Brown in Seattle, Washington. But for me, I think what's particularly interesting about, especially about Ferguson, is the way in which activists in Ferguson, across this country and beyond, linked Ferguson with Palestine, with the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, and how not only in terms of visually, in terms of officers, heavily armed officers pointing their guns at various protesters, but the ways in how protesters pointed out how many of those same weapons that were employed in the West Bank were actually, of course, built in the States. From Palestine to Ferguson, from Ferguson to Palestine, occupation is a crime. Black Lives Matter. Of course, one of the criticisms of Black Lives Matter was that it supposedly didn't have a program, that it was too decentered. It didn't have a clear set of demands. Well, as folks may know, from July 24th through July 26th, 2016, Movement for Black Lives called a national conference consisting largely of grassroots groups, organizations. And they put forward this really, and I don't know if folks have had the opportunity, this really brilliant, cutting-edge program that, again, understands black freedom in a transnational and intersectional terms, calls for the end of mass incarceration, calls for reparations, frames all this in a global context. And don't forget where this event was held. It was held in Cleveland, in part to coincide with the Republican National Convention, but as well, again, speaking to the importance of Cleveland as a site of protest. In fact, the statement, and I'll read a quick blurb, quote, "Black humanity and dignity requires black political will and power. Despite constant exploitation and perpetual oppression, black people have bravely and brilliantly been the driving force pushing the U.S. towards the ideals it articulates but has never achieved. In recent years, we have taken to the streets, launched massive campaigns, and impacted elections. But our elected leaders have failed to address the legitimate demands of our movement. We can no longer wait." Appreciating African American liberation in transnational and intersectional terms, the Vision for Black Lives asserted, quote, that patriarchy, exploitative capitalism, militarism, and white supremacy knows no borders, end quote. Which again brings us, and this might be a good place to wrap it up and to close. And again, to think about where we started. The Midwest, a site where we can see all the major historical developments of this world for the last 6 centuries. The Midwest as a counter-narrative to prevailing ideas or framings of this region as a democratic space open to all. The Midwest is a key site for African Americans, and the Midwest finally as a site for building a new world. So I'd like to end where I began by reading the passage from Black Metropolis. Quote, "The people of Bronzeville and of Midwest Metropolis and of all their counterparts are intertwined and interdependent." Intertwined and interdependent. What happens to one affects all, todos. A blow struck for freedom in Bronzeville finds its echo in Chongqing, Moscow, and Paris and Senegal. A victory for fascism. A victory for fascism. In Midwest Metropolis will sound the death knell for the common man, the common person, the common boy, girl, trans person. I added that, everywhere. The Midwest matters, from Fort Detroit to Ferguson. Why studying black Midwestern history matters in the era of Trump. Thank you. All right, so Scott, we got some time. So how much time do we have?
We've got about 10 minutes for
Okay.
questions, so if you have one, we ask that you move up to the microphones up at the front of the room.
And given that time is short, if we could just keep your questions succinct, if you could identify yourself, maybe we'll take a few questions and then I will respond. Okay? Any questions, comments, points of clarification, please?
I'll go quick here. John Ernie Flessner, Michigan State. Just wondering how deeply the Garveyite network went in the Midwest, outside, sort of beyond the major cities, into the smaller towns and the rural areas.
That's
Thanks.
a great question. So, you know what, and why don't I write this down? So why don't we take a few questions and then I will respond in kind. So a question about Garveyism and then as well as in the rural areas, please. Yes.
Paul Murphy from Grand Valley State. Thanks for the great talk.
Thank you.
I want to pick up on that, but so what are the connections between Garveyism in the Midwest and black nationalism and, say, current politics of Black Lives Matter? Can you trace out some
great.
strong ties there?
That's great. Thank you. Yes.
Hi, Emily
Hello.
Wagner, Loyola University, Chicago.
Hello.
I recently took a class on slavery and abolition, and you talked about mass incarceration. I was introduced to Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow,
Yep.
and I was wondering what your thoughts were on that and how that is impacted within the Midwest.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Okay, mass incarceration in the Midwest. All right. Why don't I start? I'll start with the two questions about Garveyism. Without question, so again, Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, St. Louis, Pittsburgh, although of course Pittsburgh is in Pennsylvania, but I would argue in some ways, at least during the early and mid 20th centuries, it was more of a kind of Midwestern city than an East Coast city with, in light of all the steel. Those cities were, as well as Cincinnati, were real hubs of the Garvey movement. Garvey himself recognized and publicly stated the importance of those cities. Garvey, Amy Jakes Garvey, a very important spokesperson as well as his second wife, often visited this region. I'm actually proud to say that in Detroit, my great-grandfather actually spoke on a podium with Mr. Garvey. But also I should say that Garveyism was also strong in smaller towns, smaller locales, places like Hamilton, Ohio. Actually in Champaign-Urbana, where I live, there was actually a UNIA division there. So certainly yes in bigger cities, but of course as well as Grand Rapids, Lansing. So that yes, while Garveyism in the Midwest was more of an urban phenomenon than a rural one, but at the same time there was a rural presence. The question about Garveyism, black nationalism, and Black Lives Matter. What I would say is this, is that first and foremost that really all black movements in some ways are inheritors, are standing on the shoulders of Garveyites, black nationalists who came before them. I think what's interesting about Black Lives Matter, again, a movement that was founded by 3 black queer women, how Black Lives Matter has been, although certainly we can complicate this, but at one level, the way in which women have been hyper visible in the movement and the ways in which the movement has tried to tackle issues around patriarchy, homophobia, transphobia within the movement. That's not to say that, and certainly the Garvey movement, women were incredibly visible, and certainly women did contest patriarchy, but at the same time it was a kind of heteronormative movement. So I think the difference would be, but of course there's sexism and homophobia within the contemporary Black Lives movement. But I think what's different about contemporary black movements is a kind of acknowledgement of these questions around gender and sexuality. And then the third question about mass incarceration in the Midwest, where to begin? I think, and again, the word ironic is not the right word, right? So you have, in my where I currently live in Illinois, many of the prisons, of course, are located in downstate Illinois. Those prisons, of course, downstate is filled. Actually, let's go back to our map, actually. I think this actually works in terms of the 2016 election. So most of those prisons, again, are located in the southern part of the state. I got a clicker around here somewhere. Okay, good, there we go. So through here and through here. And if you look, or rather, so through here, this is the red part of the state, right? And also, of course, a rural part of the state that has been in a serious economic crisis for decades. Smaller farmers have been forced off their land, those large corporate agribusinesses. And of course, those prisons are warehousing black and brown men, basically from Chicago and East St. Louis. And again, it's, center sites of strong support for Hillary Clinton. Again, these kinds of race, class, gender politics, as well, of course, in the state of Michigan. From as you all know, all those prisons up in the UP, right, filled with warehousing, really, right? Black men from Detroit, Flint, Lansing. Again, and also the student mentioned Michelle Alexander, a great book as well. A person I would suggest you all read is Ruthie Gilmore, Golden Gulag, her book on mass incarceration and the state of California, framing it again, understanding the impact of globalization. And what she's arguing is that, again, and she isn't the only one, but how she argues that incarcerated people are basically surplus labor. And as I teach in my class, African peoples were brought to the Americas to work. That's why we were brought here. And given the impact of automation, given the impact of deindustrialization, cities like Detroit, there simply aren't enough jobs, viable jobs in the formal economy for black people. So the argument goes, well, what do you do with people? Surplus populations, what do? You lock them up. You warehouse them. And again, all these prisons are so often located in areas, impoverished, rural areas that, again, have been hit hard by an agricultural crisis. More questions, please. Are we good for time, or we got to wrap it up?
I'm afraid.
Oh, you got a terrible job of cutting me off. Well, fair enough, fair enough. Well, folks, thank you for your
Okay.
okay.
Yes, thank you. Let's please, everyone give a round of applause.